Senator McDonald, will you now be rotating your farm imagery in the background?
Yep, this is the cows eating my homework.
Okay, we are now live streaming. Everyone knows about the cows and the homework. This is the Senate Finance Committee. This is February 5th. And we are going to start our discussion today with the Connectivity Fund. And Dan Dickerson is with us. And Dan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for having me. For the record, Daniel Dickerson from the Joint Fiscal Office. I am going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. And let's see, full screen mode. There we go. Okay, so I've got sort of two parts to the presentation. I know that based on, I think what I heard from Faith, you wanted to hear sort of the financial picture for the Connectivity Fund. I have that, but I also have some background. I think there's a broader discussion about the Universal Service Fund. So I've got a few other slides I can touch on, but if you've heard it, then I can skip over and just go right to the financials.
We have new committee members, so I think the background would be a good refresher for some of us and a good tutoring for the rest.
Okay, great. So I'll talk about the Universal Service Fund first, really sort of a very high level view, and then I'll dive into the Connectivity Fund. So the Universal Service Fund was created in 1994 to increase telecom access for Vermont households. It's an interesting fund in that a fiscal agent actually manages the money coming in and the money going out, and that fiscal agent currently is Solix. I'm not sure if they've always been the fiscal agent, but I know they are now. The primary revenue source for this fund is the Universal Service Charge, and that's applied. If I go to, let's say, Verizon and buy a cell phone plan, then depending on the cost of the plan, that charge would be applied to it. And I think it might apply to other things. I don't know the complete picture of what the charge could be applied to, but broadly, I think if you have a cell phone plan, you're going to pay this charge. And the current charge as of FY20 is 2.4%, and it's structured in the statute so that 2% flows to the Universal Service Fund, and then 0.4% goes to the Connectivity Fund, which is sort of a subset of the Universal Service Fund. Most of the revenues that go, of this 2.0%, most of that is used to fund enhanced 911 services, and then some of the remaining revenues go to also fund administration of the fund, which is Solix. And then also there's an audit firm or an accounting firm that does an audit every year. The telecommunication relay service and Lifeline. And then prior to, under current law as well, but really prior to FY20, if there were funds available at the end of a year that Solix identified, then those could be shifted over to the Connectivity Fund. So that's really the very, very high level view of the overall Universal Service Fund. And then the financial picture for the fund is, on this slide, and I've only provided 3 years, but the 3 years really tells a pretty a story about how the fund has been performing. So you see FY18, 5.8 million in revenues from that 2% charge. FY19, 5.3 million. FY20, they go up to 5.9, but that's really driven by the new 0.4% that went into effect in FY20, as well as the charge being applied to prepaid wireless. But the reality for at least the 2.0% charge is that it was only 4.5 million in FY20. And so there's really a downward trend in revenues for the fund, really being propped up in 20 by the fact that, the charge increased and the base increased. Expenses in FY18, it was 7.3 million. And of that, a good chunk was a disbursement of accrued connectivity fund dollars. And then the rest is sort of the operating costs, EU911, administration, Lifeline, as I'd mentioned earlier. FY19, 5.6 million, FY20, 5.5. And on the next slide, I'm going to key in on FY20, specifically for the Universal Service Fund. So in FY20, the fund brought in 5.9 million. 4.9 of that is from the 2% charge, and also on the addition of prepaid wireless as a cost that the charge would be applied to. And then 1 million is the 0.4% that's now going to the connectivity fund. Expenses, however, were 5.45 million, and that's excluding the connectivity spending. And so at the end of FY20, there was an operating deficit of 0.55 million. That was also the case in FY19, and it'll also very likely be the case in FY21. So there is an issue in the Universal Service Fund that, expenses are exceeding the revenues coming in. So that's, I guess, the big picture. I think that's probably what's driving the discussion on the connectivity fund today. So hopefully you find that helpful. Are there any questions on the greater Universal Service Fund before I go into the connectivity fund?
Any questions? I can't see everybody.
Yeah, Dan, this is Senator Hardy. Could you just go over the revenues for the fund in FY20? The 2% and the 0.4% split is. Sorry, I'm trying to look at the slides and ask my question at the same time, but could you just go over that again?
Yeah. So I think it was Act 179, which passed and was signed into law in 2019. So effective FY20, it created a new 0.4% charge that is specifically dedicated to the connectivity fund. So previously there was just the 2%, but nothing went to the connectivity fund unless the fiscal agent identified, excess unspent funds at the end of a given year. And so there was concern that the connectivity fund was not getting enough money. And I think that's what drove this change. And that's why I showed them as being split in FY20, because the 4.9% or the 4.9 million, excuse me, that goes to the Universal Service Fund is used specifically for E911, the admin costs, Lifeline, and then the telecommunication relay service. And so that is for those purposes. And then the 1 million in FY20 is to the connectivity fund. And I'll explain the uses of the monies going to the connectivity fund further on. But in statute, it's two separate universal service charges that go two separate directions.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and FY20 was the first year of this split?
Yes,
okay,
that's
okay.
correct.
That makes sense. Thanks.
So, big picture, going back really to FY19, there's this operating deficit in the Universal Service Fund. So now going to the Connectivity Fund, this was created in 2014 as a separate funding mechanism for the high cost program and the connectivity initiative. I'm not expertly versed on these two programs, but I believe the high cost program is meant to If you're a service provider that's operating in a high cost area or an area that's where costs are high and it doesn't necessarily make financial sense for you to continue operating there, then this program is meant to provide funding to sort of make the bottom line more appealing for these providers. And then the connectivity initiative, I believe, is for projects to extend broadband service. So similar, but different, or somewhat different.
High cost program was, if I'm remembering correctly, the providers that do landlines are required to provide universal access. So while we're talking about the cost of trying to get broadband up to the last house, the telephone companies, old landlines, have to extend up there. And sometimes that's very expensive. And I think, if I'm remembering, and Dan, you can correct me, this was an effort to offset that cost, given that they were getting all kinds of competition from cell service for the cheaper, more universal. And this was just trying to give them a little cushion. Am I remembering that correctly?
I don't know for sure. Like I said, I'm not expertly versed in the high cost program. So I can look into it and get back to you to give you a definitive answer.
My memory is that Roger Nishi, who was with us the other day, and Waitsfield, Champlain Valley Telecom, they were very involved. Okay, so we can keep going.
Let's see. Okay, per the statute, if Solix, prior to FY20, when the dedicated funding began, if Solix found, or the fiscal agent identified funds that could go to the connectivity fund, then statute requires that 45% is allocated to the high cost program and 55% to connectivity. So prior to 2020, as I mentioned, there was no dedicated funding source. It was the connectivity fund was only funded if there were available monies in the Universal Service Fund, or an appropriation could be made. As of 2020, there's this new separate 0.4% charge that goes directly to the connectivity fund. Of those proceeds, per statute, up to 120,000 of that is dedicated to reimbursing the Department of Public Service for a rural broadband specialist. So the next slide is going to be a table with a lot of numbers. I want to just touch on a few things, and then I'm actually going to come back to this table further on. And the things I'm going to touch on are the lines that I've labeled 1, 2, and 3. And so line 1 is basically, if you go over to the column FY20, at the end of FY20, there was a roughly $2.02 million balance in the connectivity fund. And then going down to lines 2 and 3, of that 2.02 million, 820,000 of that is obligated, and I'll explain that further on. And then 1.2% is unobligated. So like I said, it's a lot of numbers. Just keep those on your mind for now. I'll give a little more explanation, and then I'll come back to this table. Hopefully it'll make a little more sense. So as far as the funds coming in, as I mentioned, prior to FY20, the funds were allocated to the connectivity fund when they were identified as being available by the fiscal agent. So that basically means, you've had this greater universal service fund, there are revenues coming in from that charge, and then payments made for, enhanced 911, Lifeline, administrative costs. Any excess after that the fiscal agent could say, okay, we have this much money, we'll send it to the connectivity fund to be used for the high cost program and the connectivity initiative. There has been a general downward trend in monies being identified by the fiscal agent between FY15 and FY19. And I just touched on 2 years, but in FY15, it was 1.92 million. And then all the way over to FY19, it's 400,000. So pretty big disparity. But as of FY20, there's now this dedicated funding source. So 0.4% of this universal service charge goes directly to the connectivity fund. And in FY20, that was about $1 million. Some of that was still identified as a receivable, so it hadn't yet been received by the state at the end of FY20, but it's $1 million total. Over the past 6 years, other funds have come into the connectivity fund. A $300,000 capital bond was appropriated in FY17. And then there were funds appropriated in Act 179, but they were for very specific uses that were beyond the scope of just the connectivity initiative and the high cost program. But the primary funding source prior to FY20 are from the funds identified by the fiscal agent, and then as of FY20 from this 0.4%. Now the funds going out, it is slightly more complicated in that we have obligations, and then we have the payments that are made from those obligations. So to give you a rough idea of the process, the Public Service Department might receive, X number of requests for funding for either the high cost program or the connectivity initiative, and they consider those. And then, in a given year, they'll say, okay, we'll grant this amount of money for, X number of initiatives. And that's where they've created this obligation. And then as the projects take place or as expenses are incurred, then the department will make disbursements against those grants that they've promised. And so there's the amounts obligated are, or at least they have been historically greater than what has actually been paid out from the fund. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So to date, about 3.78 million has been obligated for various projects and for the position that was created in FY20 and has to be funded from the connectivity fund dollars. Then to date, approximately 3 million in payments have been made against those obligations. So as of the end of FY20, there's about 820,000 that is still obligated but has not been paid. Now, what I haven't gotten an answer on yet is, if let's say the department, made a grant or an obligation in FY15. I don't know how long it is before, they say, okay, the project's complete. Any excess that we had obligated now goes back into sort of an unobligated balance. But what I do have right now is they've got about 820,000 that's still obligated. And I don't know at this point how much of that will actually be paid out and how much, might end up being sort of recommitted to the fund as an unobligated balance. So that's some background that hopefully when I jump back to this table, it'll help the table make a little more sense. So you see the first few lines are the funds coming in over the past 6 years. So you've got the first 2 lines being funds coming that were identified by the fiscal agent for the connectivity initiative and for the high cost program. Then in FY17, you had this one-time capital bond. And then in FY20, you've got this 880,000 that was received for the 0.4%. And then you've got these other revenues, most of that, or about 100,000 of that being 0.4, the part of the 0.4 that they've accounted for as a receivable, but hasn't actually been received yet. And then I think there's some interest that's accrued, and I think rents for antennas they've collected, but those are both pretty small. So those are the total inflows. And then the funds out are where they've actually made disbursements on the obligations. So this is money actually going out the door in this 6-year period. There's some money that's been paid from the capital bond, and then there's money that was paid for the new position. I'll note that the position wasn't hired until November of 19. So in FY20, the total costs were only about, I think, 6 or 7 months. And then FY21, it'll be a full year for the position.
This is how we've been paying for broadband expansion up until we got the 30 million in federal funding this past year. So this has been our broadband initiative, or the funding we've had to put towards it.
I think primarily yes. I don't know if there had been other federal funds that had come in prior to the big ones that came in last year. But yeah, I think as far as state funding, I think this is it. So below the funds out, I've got a line that says the annual balance. So that just says, in FY15, X number of funds came in, X number of funds went out, and here's the and here's the annual balance. And then on this line that I labeled line 1, total ongoing balance, this is sort of, the carry forward, either, positive balance or negative balance from year to year, although it's been always a positive balance. And that gets us to this 2.02 million. And then further on, I touch on the obligated funds just to show, let's see over here. You can see my mouse, right? I'm not just pointing to myself.
No, we can see it.
Okay. So there's this 3.8 million that's obligated, but only 3 million of that has been spent to date. And so that gets me to the 820,000 that I identified as still obligated, and then the 1.12 or 1.2 million that's unobligated.
Questions at this point? Not seeing or hearing it.
Anderson,
I can't see you. Is that Senator Sorokin?
it is Senator Cummings. Thank you. Couple of questions. When we carved off this 0.4% from the Universal Service Fund, it seems to have yielded more money than the leftover funds from previous years. Was there a loser in terms of recipients from the Universal Service Fund by putting more money or dedicating money to broadband?
I don't know that there was a loser. I mean, I guess if you look at the other, if you think about it as, there was a possibility of either just making the charge 2.4%, but then keeping the previous policy of, if Solix identified available funds, then they would go to the connectivity fund. I guess if it's that, or creating 2 separate charges and having the funds go to 2 separate places, then, I think the Universal Service Fund loses by doing 2 separate charges, and that, now we're looking at this funding shortfall for the Universal Service Fund, and, the connectivity fund is comparatively looking like it's in pretty good shape.
So did I miss something? But when we dedicated the 0.4%, did we also increase the Universal Service Fund, or we didn't change it?
Didn't change it.
Okay.
Yeah, my memory says that the law said universal service charge could be up to 2.4%, and it had varied in there and we were getting a couple thousand a year. So we set it at a hard 2.4 and said that top 4 or 0.4 was to be dedicated, but I don't remember any indication that anybody else would lose. We may be proven wrong, but that wasn't a decision we made. Up until then, the 2% had been covering, is my recollection. I think, Senator, you were on the committee. This was 2 years ago.
That's
We
right.
did
It was a few years ago.
Yeah,
I'll just jump in and say you're mostly right, except I don't think the charge was ever 2.4%. I think it was up to 2%, and then you created sort of this hard 2%
Okay.
later on. And then you subsequently in Act 179 said, okay, we're going to leave the universal service charge piece that goes to the fund, or the universal service fund piece at 2%, and now we're going to create this separate connectivity fund piece at 0.4%. So the
Okay.
rate is effectively 2.4%, but it's
Right.
it's two separate charges that go to two separate places.
Okay. So thank you for that. And my follow-up question, so we're not spending the money on the connectivity portion as fast as it's coming in, it looks like, from this chart. And is that outside your research as to why that might be? And I guess I just need a refresher on the connectivity fund in terms of what the award process is, the application award process. Is it just people come forward and say they want a grant, or is there prioritization? How does that work?
I think that would be a better question for somebody at the Department of Public Service. Unfortunately, I don't have, as far as the process of, someone applying for that funding and receiving it, I don't have the details. But I think you're right in that, the funds are coming in a lot faster than they're going out the door. I did have one final slide that gets at what you just said a little bit. Based on what I've heard from the department, their intent is to, and this is the second bullet here, they're planning to make 2 million in grant awards this winter. I don't think they've done it yet, and I don't know what their timeline is, but they plan on at least obligating a decent chunk of the money that they're carrying. Plus, they will still have to pay the position in FY21. So they've been slow at least committing the funds, but from what I've been told, their plan is to do so, in the near future. But like I said, I don't know when exactly that would be.
Fair enough.
maybe because we charge them with distributing all the CRF money by the end of December. Plus, I think we heard all the utility funds by the end of December. So I think they've probably just been busy. But this was, as we were talking about planning and broadband, until the federal money came in with the pandemic, this is the budget we had for expanding broadband, unless we could have gotten some other grants. But this was the state funding that we were making available. And
Madam Chair.
yes, I've seen Senator Hardy. Was that Senator Pearson?
Yeah,
Okay,
uh,
Senator Hardy.
just to comment that, recall 2 years ago, we set up the VITA loan. So we had to obligate some funding to kickstart that. So I just want to make sure, in case folks are watching, it's not just been this 2 million. We also tried to find other ways of doing money, but.
Senator Hardy.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Dan, you mentioned that this fund has a fiscal agent. is it, both funds have the same fiscal agent, the Connectivity and Universal Service Fund, the whatever company you mentioned that's the fiscal agent, and why, but the Public Service Department disperses the funds or awards the grants. Why is there a separate fiscal agent?
I think that the fiscal agent is primarily dealing with the Universal Service Fund. And then when funds are identified to go to the Connectivity Fund, then it falls to, I think it's, I don't know if it's the Division of Connectivity or the Connectivity Initiative within the department. So then the money falls within their purview. So I might have, I apologize if I sort of, I might have confused that issue, but I believe, or my understanding is that Solix, the fiscal agent, is dealing primarily with the Universal Service Fund, and then the Connectivity Fund really falls within, or falls under the management of the Department of Public Service.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm just wondering, I'm still wondering why we have this separate outside fiscal agent and if that is adding to administrative costs rather than just having it be a state fund. If there's some legal reason why.
I don't have that answer for you. I think the fiscal agent has been around since there's been the Universal Service Fund. I don't know. I mean, you know, if we're looking at a cheaper option, I don't know that it would be a whole lot cheaper to put that in under the management of the department. I mean, you know, I think the administrative costs are somewhere around $100,000 to $200,000 a year, which, you know, if you have one position, you know, in state government that's dedicated to that, that's $100,000 alone. And then, you know, and I don't know how many people they would need dedicated if the state was managing this. But I think the fiscal agent has been the manager of the Universal Service Fund since its inception.
Okay.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Get my agenda back up. Committee. Any questions for Dan at this point, or questions you want us to get further information on? Okay, if not, then we're going back to the E911, and I guess just heard there was a deficit. Looks like there might be, and we've got Barb Neal and Roger Marcoux, and the floor is yours. I don't know how you set this up for presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my video, and I'm hoping not with my audio. So I'd just like to check and make sure that you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay. And typically, I give an overview presentation, and then the board chair, Roger Marcoux, may have more to add. Roger, is that the format that you want to take today?
Yes, please, and good afternoon to everybody.
Okay, thank you. So for the record, I am Barbara Neal, Executive Director of the Enhanced 911 Board. I sent over a document this morning that I believe is on your website if you'd like to follow along. With my video issues, I'm not sure I'll be able to effectively share it here. But if you open that document,
share it, I think.
Okay, all right. So I am here today to discuss the current budget deficit being experienced by the Vermont 911 program. And as a bit of context and background, especially for the new members on the committee, I thought I would start with a very high level and brief overview of the Enhanced 911 Board and our work. So moving on to slide 2 of that handout, the Enhanced 911 Board has been defined in statute since 1994 as the single governmental agency responsible for statewide enhanced 911. The board is an independent state board, not currently attached to any other agency or department in state government. and the 911 board is responsible for the design, implementation, and operational oversight of the statewide 911 system. And moving now to the third slide, you will see a map labeled PSAP configuration. The 911 board partners with 5 law enforcement agencies in Vermont for 911 call handling services. This is where the 911 calls are actually answered in these 6 public safety answering points. A formal memorandum of understanding exists with each PSAP, and which defines the responsibilities of the PSAP, the responsibilities of the board, and includes the metrics and performance measures related to PSAP reimbursement. Moving on to the next slide, in 2020, a few statistics for you. The call takers in those 6 PSAPs answered just under 210,000 calls for service. 71% of those calls were from wireless devices, which is up slightly since 2019, and that number percentage of wireless calls is expected to increase as we move forward. It takes a call taker about 5 seconds to answer a 911 call. They stay on the line with a 911 caller for about 2 minutes. And in that 2 minutes, they are assessing the emergency, getting the location of the emergency, identifying and notifying the appropriate emergency responders or their dispatch centers, and providing any needed pre-arrival instructions to help keep the situation from hopefully getting any worse before responders arrive on scene. Vermont was the first in the nation to deploy statewide text to 911. That was back in 2014. And last year we received 340 text to 911 calls for assistance. Moving on to slide 5. Current key initiatives. Last October, following a 3-month delay related solely to COVID-19, the board and our new system provider InDigital successfully implemented the new statewide next generation 911 system. The partnership with InDigital is good for Vermont and will save us about $1 million in operating costs as compared to the last system provider over the course of the next 5 years. We have also undertaken some rulemaking recently. Back in July of 2019, the board adopted a rule requiring enterprise communication systems, which are multi-line telephone systems, to deliver specific and granular location information to a 911 call taker when a call is made from the system. This helps ensure that responders can locate an individual in need of assistance, even in a multi-room facility like an office building or a school. And then just last month, in January 2021, Vermont became the second state in the nation after California to adopt telephone service outage reporting requirements by rule for wireless and VoIP service providers at significantly lower thresholds than is required by the FCC, and at thresholds which are much more appropriate for Vermont's rural nature. And this rule became effective just yesterday. The carriers will need to begin reporting outages as soon as they are technically capable of doing so, but no later than 6 months from yesterday. Also, key initiative is the 911 compliance grant program that our office administers. This is a program that provides matching funds of up to $25,000 to support upgrades to telecommunication systems in Vermont public schools, so that those schools are able to send the information that is required in that ECS rule that I just described, the Enterprise Communication System rule. We started, or the legislature started, the compliance grant program back in 2016, when fewer than 20% of Vermont schools were able to send that granular location information. And today, over 80% of the public schools are capable of meeting the requirements. And the schools that don't yet meet the requirements have in place interim procedures to ensure that the end users know what to expect when dialing 911. By the time we get to the end of 2021, we should be at about 87% compliance with those requirements for Vermont Public Schools. And finally, another program that we work on quite a bit is the CARE program. We partner with Vermont Emergency Management, the Vermont Department of Health, 211, and the United Ways of Vermont on a program called CARE, which stands for Citizens Assistance Registry for Emergencies. This program allows citizens who would need special assistance in an extended power outage, an isolation, or an evacuation event to be identified in the 911 GIS data, that's the mapping data, in advance so that the information can be available to responders during those large-scale events. And moving on to the reason for our conversation today on slide 6. By the end of FY21, we are projecting a deficit in the Enhanced 911 Special Fund of between $575,000 and $1 million. Let me step back a second. The projected deficit is the result of the ongoing and unresolved revenue shortfalls that you just heard about in the Vermont Universal Service Fund. I did miss the very part of the first part of the previous speaker's presentation, so I'm hoping that my next little bit won't be too repetitive, but just to make sure you have the information. As you probably know, the Enhanced 911 Special Fund is supported solely by the Vermont Universal Service Fund. We receive no general funds. And that VUSF, Vermont Universal Service Fund, is managed by a fiscal agent contracted by the Public Service Department. And the fee for the Vermont Universal Service Fund is currently set at 2.4% on retail telecommunications sales in Vermont. I did hear the explanation about where that 0.4% is now dedicated to the connectivity fund, so I won't repeat that. And I think you were also likely told that statute requires that distribution from the Vermont Universal Fund go in a particular priority. And Vermont is not, or 911 rather, is number 4 on that list of priorities. We certainly do take the biggest chunk out of the Vermont Universal Service Fund. In FY20, our appropriation was about 4.9 million, and this year it is 4.8 million, approximately. A little bit of history on the deficit issue itself. In late 2019, Commissioner Tierney from the Public Service Department informed me, Commissioner Gresham, and our budget analysts and financial professionals that the Universal Service Fund would likely not be sufficient to support the 911 Special Fund appropriation in FY20. And in the end, we did not receive approximately $674,000 of that FY20 appropriation of just over 4.9 million. So that was in FY20, but because of earlier careful planning in previous budget cycles, we were able to manage cash flow through the end of FY20, but the impacts are certainly being felt now and continuing as a result of this shortfall. So in addition to the $675,000 or $74,000 impact on the FY20 appropriation, we are currently behind by approximately $400,000 in the FY21 distribution as well. So when the appropriation is passed or approved by the legislature, we're paid in monthly, 1/12 of that appropriation each month. And at this point, those monthly disbursements are short about $400,000. Now, if, and it's a really big if, because we're already behind by that amount, if we were to receive our entire FY21 appropriation of 4.8 million, we will still end this fiscal year approximately $575,000 short in the 911 fund. Now, if we don't receive the entire appropriation, which seems likely given past experience and given the current projections that the Universal Service Fund is still not bringing in the revenues that it needs, the situation will be much worse, potentially up to $1 million or so in shortfall. So we see two problems in need of a solution. One is the immediate deficit and the need to make the Enhanced 911 fund whole. And then, of course, the longer term problem of the inability of the Vermont Universal Service Fund to support the programs that depend upon it. And that is the short version of the budget deficit. The final page in that presentation is my contact information if you need it, and I'm happy to take any questions or to see if the board chair, Roger Marcoux, would like to add anything at this point.
Let's go to Mr. Marcoux and then we'll ask questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have much more to add. It is what it is, and Barb, I think you'll agree, has laid it out very well. We've been in front of several, we've discussed this with several people in administration, and we've talked to Senator Kitchell. And at the end of the day, even if we come up with the money, the big picture problem is that the fund, as it was designed to do back in the mid-90s, is no longer able to support our program. And and I think that's just a technology. For example, you don't pay taxes on data, and a lot of people are using text and data in the phones. So that's a huge concern I have, and I think I'll just leave it at that and be available with Barb to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, that may answer my question is, why is the money going down? Because I haven't seen phone usage going down. But if we're only taxing voice and not all those text messages or maybe emails, that may be something to look at. Okay. Senator Hardy, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Barb, for the presentation. It's nice to see you again. What exactly is the charge on? I think that's sort of what Senator Cummings was getting at. Is it on the sale of actual hardware and equipment? Is it on the sale of software? Is it on the sale of usage? And so that's one question. And another for Dan, maybe you have this nice spreadsheet of the connectivity fund. You have the same kind of spreadsheet for the Universal Service Fund, because I'd love to see that kind of detail for this fund, or maybe Barb has it, I don't know. And then if it is charging on actual equipment that is purchased, if you buy a phone over the internet, is that, you're shaking your head, and so maybe it's not on equipment.
No, it's on. I always thought it's on your phone bill.
Service.
And
it's on the service itself, not on the
service itself. And
Gotcha.
Last year we extended that to if you buy the prepaid cards, so many hours. So we put the tax on the prepaid cards, which is where they picked up a little bit of money last year. But it is on, I will say I wasn't aware, I thought that was on my whole phone bill. I think it says government services or charges or something. But I just expanded my data usage. So I guess if I'm not talking as much, but I'm texting more. So that may be where we're losing it. Barb. Yeah. Barb.
Yes, so the way I explain this, and really the people who are the experts on the Vermont Universal Service Fund are at the Public Service Department, namely Clay Purvis, who's the Director of Telecommunications and Connectivity there. He can do a very good and detailed job of explaining sort of the mechanics of the Vermont Universal Service Fund. And I think Senator Hardy, he might be able to provide the charts and graphs that you were just referring to about how the Vermont Universal Service Fund as a whole has been performing. So he would be a good resource on that. But the way that I describe it always is the fee is 2.4% of retail telecommunications sales. So it's on the voice service that you have on any device. A wireline telephone, for example, is all voice service. But when you get into wireless, you can have portions of the package that you buy that is for voice, and a portion is for data or information sharing, and that only the voice portion is has this fee assessed on it. So that's a very simple way of explaining it. But as I'm sure you all know, the use of wireline service is going down, 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 and people are moving over to services that have a component of voice, but the larger service is really data. So the fee is not assessed in the same manner there. I hope that helps a little bit with the question.
Also,
Yeah,
voice
absolutely.
over internet as well as not text.
Voice over internet is not.
That's right. VoIP. We cannot tax VoIP. So I'm paying the tax on my cell phone, but not on my home phone because that's coming in via Comcast. Even though because we aren't allowed, we have tried to tax them. We are not allowed to tax them. Which may be why your revenues are going down. Senator Sorokin, do you have a question?
I do
No.
not.
Okay. Senator Bray does.
Quick question on Comcast. So when it's whatever it's called, triple play, so
VoIP.
VoIP, yeah. But I mean when it's a bundled service, so you're getting TV and broadband and phone. Are we not allowed to add the fee for just the proportion that might be called your phone bill within that bundle?
I believe the testimony the other day was no. And I know we have tried to do that in the past. We cannot tax or regulate internet services, which is
Well, I mean,
what's
I don't
driving
know-
people crazy.
Right. I don't know to what degree voice is migrating to VoIP on a service we can't influence that way. But it maybe those companies would be amenable to, it wouldn't be a tax. Maybe they could make a contribution. I'm not kidding. There could be a conversation to be had.
Have that conversation. Okay.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Did the governor's budget include any funding proposals in this area? And also, you did receive some CRF funding, I believe, and I was wondering what that was specifically for.
Yeah, I don't have the dollar amount right in front of me on that CRF funding, but we did use some of those funds for costs related to the delay in our new system implementation. So we needed to continue to have our previous system provider, Consolidated, continue to maintain the service during a 3-month delay. And so those funds were used to pay the cost difference between what Consolidated costs us and what the new and digital system would cost. Also, some of those funds went to standing up an emergency operations center at the board office, basically taking our training positions and making them, setting them up so they would be able to provide live call taking in a situation where a PSAP was impacted staffing wise by COVID-19. It would be one more place where people could go to take 911 calls. I believe the amount that we were appropriated from those funds was about 200,000, and we did not. There was some that was given back in October. We knew that we were not going to need it before the end of the year. And I think we came in around the 75,000, used about $75,000 of those funds, if I recall correctly, and I can get you the exact figure if you need. And on the question of the budget, we did, as the board chair mentioned, we did have conversations with the administration, finance and management, Secretary Young, and so on about this issue, but it was not addressed in the budget adjustment or the budget. So here we are.
Okay. Okay. And do you have any projections about, because it didn't look like your costs were going up. They looked fairly stable, just a couple of years we saw, and the income was fairly stable, except the income has continued to go down. I assume, like most of us, just with salaries and benefits, that yours go up.
Well, we do have, the normal changes, of course, in salaries and benefits. Also, some of the internal fees, between agencies and state government had caused a little bit of a bump as well. But we are actually right now, some of the impacts of this are that we are carrying a vacancy in our training and communications department, which helps on the budget end of things, but significantly is impacting our quality control measures, certainly our public outreach and public education has taken a hit because of carrying that vacancy, which was due to a retirement a year or so ago. And it also impacts, it just reduces by half, because that's a 2-member team, reduces by half our resources for providing training to the 100 or so certified call takers in the state. Now, our priority is ensuring that training gets delivered, so that's where all the focus is. But these other programs are certainly being impacted already. Additionally, in order to I guess, live within our means, which is meaning living within our special fund capability, we have, for the next year's budget, we have removed a line item which sets aside funds, about $300,000, not about, exactly $300,000 each year to prepare us to build a capital fund, if you will, to allow us to implement any needed system upgrades and or system implementations that might be necessary. Typically, those happen every 5 years or so. And even if we don't move to a new system provider, which can be, as you can imagine, an expensive proposition, there will be a need for equipment refresh and system-related refreshes that will cost money. So we've taken that out of the budget request that we submitted for next year because of the realities of the inability of the Vermont Universal Service Fund to support this. But it was not done with any level of comfort to take that reserve out of the mix. And we factored in continuing that vacancy for some time, and some other consulting costs that we usually make sure we have available have been removed from next year's budget. With the current deficit, and the board chair may want to speak more to this, but the board is going to need to be considering how we will address the fact that we don't have the full appropriation from last year and this year, which could have some impacts on our ability to reimburse those 6 PSAPs I mentioned in the beginning for their call handling services. So no decisions have been made by the board on that yet, but certainly there is a real risk that we're not going to be able to meet our expenses for this year.
Okay. Any questions at this point? So I've got this on my ongoing problems list. And we will be thinking about that. I'm sure we'll be talking to appropriations about this one, because I'm sure we don't want to let E911 services drop, especially not now. So thank you, Barb, and stay in touch. If you have any thoughts about how we might stabilize your funding, let me know and we'll take a look. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
We have one witness left, which is Stephen Whitaker. And Steve, you're on the phone, I see. And we're running a little late, but Steve, you've got apparently 15 minutes. And you asked to speak on this issue.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair and the committee. I have been bringing this issue and related inextricable issues to your committee for a couple of years now. I've been involved in the Enhanced 911 system since before it was implemented in the early 90s, and tracked its evolution along the way. This deficit problem is very simple in that the costs of not addressing the governance issues and the contracting issues. You've got a lay board of lay is a term left over from Catholic school. No technical experts on the board, and they are contracting for a multi-million-dollar system. It took me quite a few years to get the board to vote to hire an independent expert engineer to come and evaluate why the system repeatedly failed when it had been shifted to Consolidate or Fairpoint at the time. So yeah, Roger Marcoux will even credit me with having not let up until they hired an expert. They found the flaws in the contracting, they found the flaws in the system and in the resiliency, and they have addressed those for the most part. This problem of the financing is simple at this point. It's part of a bigger problem. The simplest thing to do, especially in light of your having made $17 million available to the Connectivity Initiative to shovel out the door of coronavirus relief funds, to just repeal the piece of the broadband bill that dedicated that 0.4% to the connectivity fund. That would then have the connectivity fund only get a minor, if any, share of that, and the 911 fund would have a higher bite at the apple to resolve its deficit. I think the numbers come real close, but the fact that I've been discussing this at every 911 board meeting, strictly in the public comment period, for over a year now, and it's only getting to your attention now, is troubling and indicative of the governance problem you have. This was a simple thing to fix, and that's my advice on how to fix it. Is just the connectivity division is a whole nother problem of governance, which I brought to your attention, ignoring statutory requirements to hold annual meetings on the plan and on the connectivity program for 5 years in a row now. Those annual meetings have not been held. Vacancies on the board refusing to call a meeting unless the department agreed to and constrained the agenda. So it's not an independent board by any stretch. So my sense is that what you really need to think about is a reform of governance of telecommunications, and some of that you may see in a bill coming over from the House or introduced in the Senate regarding reviving the VTA. So that's a separate set. But regarding the taxing of the Universal Service Fund, it's inextricably related to the telephone personal property tax, and in the statutory obligation under Title 19, I think it is, where a obligation formerly with the Vermont Telecommunications Authority was transferred to the Transportation Agency. And under statute, I don't recall the section number, they're required to bill broadband providers for the use of the public right-of-way. Now, broadband cable companies already pay their 5% franchise fee for the AMOs in consideration for use of the right-of-way. So what the Transportation Agency has or has not been doing, and it's somewhat vague, they're supposed to be billing broadband providers an annual fee for use of the public right-of-way. Public records requests to discover how much revenue this has brought in, who's being billed, who's not being billed, they require your committee to address, because if they redact everything based on who's renting for how much, based on trade secret claims, I can't learn anything from these requests, whereas y'all have the obligation to know what's being brought in for revenue from that right-of-way fee. More troubling is the discretion left to the agency to trade, saying, I'll not charge you for this corridor if you'll go and build over here, because that basically ends around the whole telecommunications plan process and the prioritization of where broadband needs to be built. So last year, the legislature passed a bill. I believe Senator Balint was on your committee at the time, and she spearheaded the study of AMO funding. These are the public access stations, community media centers. And the scope of that study, I want to commend you, having directed that money to the Agency of Commerce instead of the Department of Public Service, because you actually, they awarded a contract, and I believe we'll be seeing that real soon. But I read the RFP, I looked at it. That is the first comprehensive look at the relationship between the ability to tax broadband, Universal Service Fund, shortfalls, telephone personal property tax, use of the right-of-way. I think you will need the rest of this year to decide what you're going to do with that information. I would encourage you to build on that study and direct on some bill, direct that some summer study continue, possibly under the Joint Information Technology Oversight Committee, possibly under a summer study committee. But you need to turn a range of options into action steps for next January. And that will, of course, be dependent on what you do with the Vermont Telecommunications Authority. So the Connectivity Fund, having just, for better or worse, distributed maybe 14 million out of the 17 million that was appropriated, does not need the 2 million that's sitting there. That money could easily be clawed back or redirected to cover the 911 deficits. But the 911 management issue will not go away. The executive order directing that 911 be attached to the new agency of public safety is ill-advised in regard that the agency of public safety has its own hands full. It is behind on its own telecommunications planning and management, and they've just lost their director of telecommunications, shared radio technology services, to retirement. So putting 911 deeper into an agency that is more opaque and less transparent and less accountable will not solve these problems. In fact, they could aggravate them. So I have recommended to the 911 board at their last meeting, and I shared a transcript of those comments with Senator Brock, that the 911 board be attached to the new VTA, because as a result of legislative directive a couple of years ago, the Public Utilities Commission held workshops on this increasing vulnerability of calling. 911 calling is more vulnerable and is impeded or blocked more often due to two issues: power outages, fiber cuts, and something called host remote isolation, where Consolidated does not build a second path, a second diverse fiber path between a host and a remote switch. So when a car accident takes out a pole, an entire exchange, this happens frequently up in Montgomery, cannot call 911, cannot call outside of anyone within their local exchange. It's a very dangerous issue, especially in areas that aren't served by cell service. So these are major problems that need your committee's attention and or summer study committee's attention. But the Public Utilities Commission did, as directed, held 4 very useful workshops and came out with a report, and it was shared with you last year. I can share it again if you need. And they recommended that the 911 board evolve into a resiliency utility. In effect, take their expertise on hardening the system as it is and focus it on making sure that as we build out broadband, that we're not further eroding the reliability of Vermonters' ability to call 911. So for that reason and others, and the tightening up the accountability and the purpose and the focus of a governing board, I've recommended that the 911 board be attached to the new VTA. And it would have that similar autonomy that an authority has, as opposed to being within a state agency. But what you don't want is to have budget priorities and evolving party swap off of governor and administration tampering with something as critical as a telecommunications public safety system. So both the VTA, which is designed to support the CUDs in building broadband, and the 911 board in supporting that resilience, making sure that they build systems that have diverse protection, reliability. Resilient is the single word that most explains it. Another problem with the 911 deficit is that we hired that consultant, and the consultant, I say we in the sense that I have a little bit of ownership in the in trying to make it right. The 911 board hired a consultant. The consultant did his job. So for the most part, fixed the contract with Fairpoint, but then came back and steered the contract to this new vendor InDigital. And then InDigital put their bid in for a bundled system. The system really should, I think I've testified to this already in this committee, but it wasn't transcribed and you got some new members. The 911 system could be more reliable and more economical if it were broken into 3 different services: the selective routing, which is the core switching, the PSAP equipment, and the network. With the broadband network that we're building, if we build it to public safety grade around the state, primarily on the Velco backbone, we would have much more affordable and more reliable. We wouldn't have to spend, $2 million a year on a system. on a system vendor. In rough terms, the $4 million budget, $1 million goes to the 911 board, $2 million goes to the vendor, another $1 million is divided among the PSAPs. But the PSAP's share is going to change. PSAP design, in effect, you may want to either this year or over the summer commission whether or not a plan is required annually or biannually of the 911 board. I doubt you're going to see a plan in the 10-year telecommunications plan that dives into the detail of the options and the cost effectiveness and the reliability of the 911 system, but you should. Those plans should fit together like hand in glove. But in the absence of that, we have a problem where the 911 board, with advice from then Assistant AG J. Pershing Johnson, who's now Governor's Counsel, has told the Public Utilities Commission that they can't look at the reliability of the 911 system, that this is exclusive domain of this lay board of non-technical experts governing 911, and the PUC should butt out. And that's not only dangerous, it's not sound governance, it's not making use of the technology expertise of the Public Utilities Commission. So that needs to be changed in statute. The 911 board should not have exclusive jurisdiction over the reliability of the system. The PUC should have full ability to look in both the pricing and the reliability of the system. So, in effect, you've created, by kind of kicking this can down the road year after year, you've created this almost critical state where the telecommunications connectivity division and the 911 board, off doing their own thing, are squandering vast sums of money and building unreliable systems. And it's time to kind of rethink the governance of these projects. And now's a good time to do it because you do have bills and emergencies necessitating action. So if I can help you see how this stuff fits together, and if you can digest the report coming out of the AMO study, that's going to really help you understand how you can remodel the revenue tax structure of these antiquated and obsolete systems of billing for telecommunication services. I put $100 on my prepaid phone that I'm talking to you on this morning. They cost me $108.40 because there's 6% sales tax and 2% for the Universal Service Fund and 40 cents for the connectivity fund. And I do pay tax on data. If people send me unsolicited texts or I make it just a directory assistance call, I end up paying that. So I hope you've got a sense of the way this stuff fits together, and that I've spent, a lot of time trying to boil it down to this few minutes. We have a problem in governance, planning, and accountability of all of these systems, and it's really up to your committee to address it. But I understand you've got a lot of competing priorities. So I'm happy
Senator Hardy has a question for you right now.
Sure.
Well, Stephen, thank you for bringing up the governance issue. I was actually going to ask Barb Neal this question but we were finishing up with her about the governance of the E911 system. It seemed kind of odd to me that there's a completely separate board that oversees that whole system. And I'm wondering if that is true in other states. First of all, if this is or if this is a unique kind of governance situation in Vermont. And it sounds to me like you're proposing the VTA, which is, I think, the Vermont Telecom Authority. Is that what VTA stands for? I see Senator Brock nodding his head. Which would be a separate agency than the public service department and separate from public safety. Yes. Okay. So it's curious to me that there's sort of another bureaucratic agency. And this is a larger conversation, obviously, but yes, it's a much larger conversation, but I am curious why you think that's the best place for the E911 system, and how this compares to the sort of setup in other states.
Well, other states often have a much deeper bench to draw from for expertise, and they have a lot of technically proficient people who are willing to serve on these boards. Ours is unique. Since the 90s, it has had a cross-section of representation from police, sheriffs, municipal police, firefighters. The League of Cities and Towns is the vacancy. They recommend a person, but they've not had a representative on the board for quite some time. So you got professional police chiefs, you got sheriffs, you got fire, you got EMS, etc. So it is a governance that creates a good stakeholder buy-in, but none of them being engaged or having the available time or capacity to address these issues of resiliency. For instance, I've been bringing up the dead zones and the relationship of the small cells, the microcells that can fill in dead zones out in the countryside so that people could call for help. It doesn't matter how expensive or big your 911 system is if you run off the road where there's no way to call for help, and yet the 911 board refuses to address that.
Okay, wait.
It's not our job. That's
Can I just-
somebody else's job.
I want to clarify just something to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So the board, from your perspective, is strong on sort of stakeholder and the emergency side of things, but weak on the tech side of things.
Tech and ownership of the envision for ownership of the resiliency. So we know that voice over internet protocol is creating a situation where a power outage makes everyone's phone unable to call as soon as the batteries are dead or the power is cut to a piece of field electronics. So the 911 board relies on hopes that the 911 calls will get into the system, but all the problems that are being created by this rapid emergence to voice over internet protocol and broadband delivered calling and texting, they don't see that as their job. And so it's not necessarily a technical issue as much as the statute doesn't define that. Similar with dispatch. What I've just described with the dead zones and that could be remedied with small cells, the same goes on the responder side. So if the towers don't lose power or a hurricane knocks down some of these radio towers, the dispatching can't happen, so the responder can't get to you. The 911 call might be answered in Williston or Westminster or any of the private PSAPs. But if they can't reach the dispatcher to deliver the call to the ambulance or the police cruiser, you're not going to get help delivered. And so what we need is a body that has this soup to nuts arc of vision and responsibility for how we make sure that from the person who runs off the road, they can have signal to make a call all the way to the first responder having radio connection to the dispatcher to actually get to where the car is off the road. And that's where this board falls short. Does that explain that?
Yes, I understand that. Thank you, Stephen.
I'm going to start trying to wrap this up because this is summarizing about 2 years worth of work. We spent an amazing amount of time on small cells, which we still have. And this will be an ongoing. We have a system that was set up. I may be the only one, maybe Senator Sirotkin remembers, but when 911 originally and E911 came into existence, there was significant pushback from Vermonters who didn't want the government knowing where they lived. And I think some of this structure may have been set up, this separate structure, to address those concerns. They didn't want the police to know their address. And so we're dealing in maybe different attitudes and looking at restructuring. We also have a deficit. So we've got a couple things we need to work on. And Senator Brock, I saw your hand up. Randy, you're muted.
I wanted to mention to the committee, as I think we have before, there is a bill being drafted to deal with a number of these issues, particularly the issue of overall governance of telecommunications involving a reconstitution of the VTA. And I hope to have that within the next week or so. There's also a bill that's in the House right now in draft form that does some of the same thing. It recreates something similar to the VTA, but in a slightly, in a radically different way. And we'll have all of those things, I think, to look at going forward.
I'm looking forward to them as a vehicle for whatever we decide to do on all of these. Okay, Senator McDonald, I think your hand is flashing in now the snow, but I think you have a question. You're muted, Senator.
What's the name of the report that Mr. Whitaker suggested we take a look at if it's supposed to be coming out in the near future?
I wrote that down.
I think it's AMO funding options, funding options for access media organizations. But it definitely, like I said, the Agency of Commerce, not the Department of Public Service, contracted for that, and they contracted to Berkshire Telecommunications. Some of you have heard testimony from Peter Blum, and you're going to wonder, why the department didn't do that work for you 5 or 10 years ago.
I have that study on my list of things we'll get a report on. Okay. Any questions at this point? All right, a lot of information, a lot of issues to deal with. Thank you, witnesses. From E911.
Thank
and
you.
Steve.
I'm going to mute.
Okay, yeah, we're going to have this committee discussion now. Committee, I believe Faith has sent out the agenda, or it is posted for next week. It's posted.
Senator Cummings, both.
It is both. So what we hoped was, yes. And I think now it's looking like on Tuesday, I may have a meeting. They're trying to, joint fiscal needs to meet to approve the latest federal money. So I may have to duck out on Tuesday. It's either that or 8:15 in the morning. But we're going to be looking at, okay, we're going to go through S60, which is a bill I put in at the request of VEPSA. That's all the municipal independent utilities. They would like some ability to have some flexible rate structure. If they go up 0.25%, they have to go in and have a full-fledged tiering at the PUC, and they would like some flexibility. So I told them I'd put it on, and they will be in on Tuesday. We've got more testimony on arrearages, and we've got Karen Horn. We're going to talk especially about municipals and the arrearages there. And then Okay, Wednesday is the Abby Shepherd Show. I've asked her to just kind of walk us through all the bills that have come to committee, which are not too many, which is normal. And then that's what we've got. We have some space on Wednesday. And then Thursday, we're going to start doing, I've asked Abby to come in and talk to us, and I was hoping maybe we could, I think it would be Jake from the tax department. We made changes and the feds made changes to the tax code, but we made significant changes to the tax code in 2018. And I thought before we started making new changes, we should refresh ourselves on what we did and what they resulted in. And then I think starting the following week, Joint Fiscal is going to be doing some presentations on our tax system and just background information, just to give us a kind of a foundation for when we start discussing tax proposals, especially those from the Tax Structure Committee. So they're working on that. For new members of this committee, I can only remember one bill that has been sent back because it wasn't ready for prime time. We try and do our homework, so when we hit the floor, we have the answers to all the questions. So it may drag on, but we will do our due diligence. And then S1 is back on for next week. And I know we've got the two people we didn't get the other day, but we're going to have some time. And we did that bill last year. I'd like, if possible, to get it out as quickly as possible this year. So let me know what you'd like to hear. What more information would you like on this one? This is Rygate. Senator Pearson, do you?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we had an email from a guy out of Massachusetts who
Yes.
I've come to understand is, typically opposed to wood burning for electricity. That's fine. But he asserted that the emissions are significantly worse than coal. And that is quite a statement of fact. So I'm just wondering where we would turn to verify that, or I don't know. I mean, maybe it just changes my vote and it doesn't have to be a big deal, but it did strike me as a pretty interesting fact, if indeed, or assertion. Whether or not it's fact, I can't verify.
Okay, we can ask someone to take a look. I believe the testimony was there were $10 million worth of scrubbers put on this plant a couple of years ago. So we'll
About
drop
10
a
years
line
ago.
over to environmental conservation or air quality division and see what they can tell us. But I remember because somebody asked yesterday about air quality and they were told that they were scrubbed. They might be having neighbors with wood furnaces. It can get pungent, and I know before we put requirements on outside boilers, there were complaints about emissions blowing into the neighbor's patio. So we can check on that.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just going back to the earlier part of Thursday. We had some testimony early on, I can't remember from who, on the PPP program and the Fed's decision to make all those loans non-taxable and deductible. And I guess the rule of thumb is that if the feds do something in their tax code, it automatically trickles down unless we do something otherwise to the state tax code. And I would like to have some more discussion about that. I understand there's millions of dollars at stake for the state of Vermont. And I'd also like to know if there's any other things that have happened in the last year where we're all automatically accepting federal policy and nobody's bringing that to our attention, that it affects the revenues of the state.
Okay. We will see if we get that in. The one time we did make that 2018 is where we do not pass through now medical deductions. We originally didn't, the charitable deductions.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on
Yeah,
that.
we
and that-
spent a lot of time on that. And I want to see if anyone can tell us what happened. Did Vermonters actually pay $30 million more, or, you know, if there's any assessment? So
That's really good to do. I mean, I agreed with some of those and some of them I didn't agree with, but it would be good to know how it worked out. But that's what I'd like to do with the PPP program and anything else that's pending this year.
and others that we've passed through. Of course,
Am I
part of
right?
the problem right now with the feds is there's a new administration, and I would anticipate, probably not in time for this year, but maybe, that they will be making changes to the tax code.
Right. Am I
I've heard a
correct?
lot of talk about undoing some of the changes that were made in 2017. So,
But am I correct that, I think I'm correct that unless we do something, there must be something in our tax code right now that those kinds of changes on the federal level automatically
I,
go into our calculation of AGI or whatever.
used to. But that would be a good question for Abby, because when we decoupled in 18, we went back and started with the federal AGI and then adjusted all of ours. So I know the federal charitable deduction was before that, so it passed through. But I thought most of the other ones did not. So if they add a new one, I mean, I don't think we want to give away any, double dipping is a little hard for us to swallow. So we'll make sure we get that.
Thank
Senator Bray, and then we'll go to Senator Hardy.
I wanted to go back to S1. So I wasn't in the committee last year, but sort of my shortest take on it was that we were, as a Senate, going to be authorizing paying above market rates to the tune of roughly $10 million over the course of the contract extension. And so that's ratepayer dollars. And that was because there was believed to be a benefit to the industry that supports that plant, like the wood products industry. So did the committee go through the math of saying, well, rather than spending $10 million that way, could we get more economic development by spending $10 million another way? Was there ever
I don't think we went through it
alternative?
in those terms. I think we were doing a lot of work at that point on the renewable energy bill, and we looked at it. Okay, and Abby Shepherd has joined us. We looked at it in terms of the renewable energy supply, like on a day like today when it's snowing, that, this is our one supply that is renewable year round. unlike water and solar. And so there was an advantage to having that. And then we did look at the wood products industry. I think if any one of us could figure out a way to stimulate the economies in the areas that this plant's working, we'd love to do it. But I don't think we did that in the specific terms you.
Okay, well, I'm just thinking, it could be that we would find something more cost effective to address that industry than, spending an extra 10 million on the electricity that we could otherwise purchase. And the market is so big, I think we could find base load clean power from another source, not generated in state, but I don't know the benefit of that particular plant generating. So I'm not picking on it. I'm just saying maybe we'd be more helpful spending $10 million in another way.
Okay. I think the testimony we had, and I believe I heard it yesterday, was that if they had to go out and pay or sell at market rate, that they would be forced to close. And
Yes.
Last year was before the sale. I don't know if that's true, but that has been the testimony.
Yes.
Well, and so
But that
I guess
doesn't answer Senator Bray's question.
No, it doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
But we would, there's a good probability we would lose the plant. The question is, can we find another source of the power in November when the sun did not shine in Vermont and the rivers are frozen? And B, can we find another market for all of the low grade branches timber that used to go to paper mills in Maine and doesn't anymore because they're closed? Can we do that, or can we find a way to offset the economic burden?
Right. Others will know much more about it, but if someone said to me that were the two things we had to figure out, one thing is there's a lot of different sources of clean, renewable baseload power. Like there's ample hydro from Maine, for instance, at a very low price available. But the
argument is that hydro is not renewable. From the true advocates, we can buy all the hydro we want from Quebec.
But legally in Vermont, we treat it won't get those RECs that they're able to trade, but that's another kettle of fish. And the other, maybe that low grade wood ends up in a pellet plant. I'm just saying there would be alternatives to burning it in a highly inefficient plant at above market rates and making ratepayers subsidize it for a decade.
Senator McDonald. Mark.
There are two different questions. One is, could you find other power? The plant might be justified running from the middle of December to the middle of March as a base load plant, but year round is a stretch. And you referenced, Madam Chair, the outdoor wood furnaces, which have been twice recalled, and we're now at a level of cleanliness that makes the first two generations much better. And possibly that's resources or other committees could look into the expanded sale of pellet boilers, which would absorb the workforce that is looking for a product to sell. With a new testimony this year about the lack of cleanliness on these plants was not dealt with last year. At the end of its 20-year life, it was extended for 10 additional years. But prior to that, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, there was some work done on it to make it cleaner than it had been for the first 20 years. But its cleanliness is still suspect in think you might want to follow up on that, how suspect it really is.
Yeah. Okay, Senator Hardy.
Thank you. I just, two things. One, I last year was a reluctant yes on the floor on this bill. And for all the reasons that have just been discussed. And so I'm not sure how I would vote on it at this point. And I would like to get more information about the environmental impact, the ratepayer impact, and alternative economic development possibilities. So just wanted to, be transparent about that. And then the second thing I was interested in maybe having on our agenda is I was under the impression that we were going to get back to some of the unused CRF funding that had not been used by the broadband funding and the stuff from the Public Service Department. And
I think that total is about 10 million, and it is going through the appropriations. That was anything that wasn't used in an emergency went through the appropriations process. And I think there may be 3 million still hanging around
because it just seemed
the
like
department.
okay, because I saw that we're voting on second reading on the budget adjustment on Tuesday, and I wasn't sure if the appropriations process meant budget adjustment.
It does.
So that's a vehicle if we wanted to make recommendations. And then also, we just heard from the E911 has a deficit in FY21, which is this current fiscal year that hasn't been dealt with. So I guess, if there's money that we can get out the door quickly to people during the pandemic to help with their connectivity issues, it seems like we want to do that on the sooner side rather than waiting for the full budget process. So I know it's second reading on Tuesday, but if there's if we could have an amendment that from this committee about how to spend some of that money, that might be helpful.
Getting that up and out by Tuesday might be a bit of a stretch, but Senator Kitchell has said budget adjustment is generally just to deal with things that have changed since we did the budget and went home. And this is, huge deficit here and we've got to move funds around. It's limited. Senator Kitchell has said that she plans on doing a bill fairly quickly to deal with some of the CRF issues and is asking committees of jurisdiction. I haven't seen a formal request to us, but I will check with her.
Okay. That would be good. I just would like to see us move faster on some of that money that is left over because people are hurting right now. And if we can avoid the full process for at least a chunk of that change, it would be helpful, I think.
I think last year we found out we will move as quickly as we can. And it will be going through the appropriations process, but as last year, the appropriations committee will be saying to us, all right, there's this much money available. How do you think it should be spent? And then we will chime in. And I will double check with her because joint fiscal is meeting again for some criteria on a new grant that the administration has. So I've just been getting emails today. I haven't had time to find out what it is.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
But that would be, I think, the process, that there will be another bill for CRF funding that will go out quickly, meaning ahead of the whole budget process.
Okay. That sounds
Okay.
good. Thank you.
Okay. Committee. So we've got some questions on Rygate. And we've got some tax questions. I'll get somebody in to talk about that ACCD study on the local TV stations. I just have Orca down because that's mine. And see what they have to say. And I want to find out more about the AOT tax on broadband providers. And I thought I had set something up for next week. And if not, it's because I goofed in my notes. Yeah, electric cooperatives, property tax exemptions. We have a bill now to exempt property tax. But taxing broadband and structures, and I didn't, use of the right of way. That's going to be a whole involved discussion, and will involve local communities, because if we exempt them from taxation, we are also exempting them from local taxation. So we'll be looking at that one. Any more fun topics?
Madam
Senator
Chair,
Bray.
on the last one you mentioned, is that the bill I put in on the broadband build out not becoming taxable?
S64, that's yours, right?
Okay, I wasn't sure the number. I didn't quite hear it on the floor.
Says an act relating to electric cooperatives and property tax exemptions for broadband infrastructure. I think that's your bill.
That's it.
And we'll walk through that. I'd still like to get a nice chart of who taxes what and at what rate. That would be very helpful. And then we can start moving things around. We may be limited in this from something that was said in testimony the other day from the PUC. I gathered there is a case before them involving Washington Electric and maybe these tax exemptions, so that if there's a case in court, that kind of starts to tie everybody's hand from rendering opinion. But we'll find that out. Because they can't prejudice the hearing.
Yeah, right, of course. I think it was related to some other aspect of operation. I'm forgetting.
Find out. Yeah.
Hopefully it's discrete, but
from this one, because I think we'd like to do it. I'm thinking we probably didn't tax electric utilities when we first were rushing to get them out. From testimony we had a couple of years ago, they didn't have right of ways to places because the farmer just said, yeah, string it through, and nobody ever signed any papers. So there were no right of ways. And we might want to do this on a time limited basis. And the other question is, if we exempt the nonprofits, do we have to exempt the for-profits under common benefits? So we'll have to see. Senator Pearson.
I think when I think of this issue, it's not really a taxation issue, it's a financing issue. If the CUDs were building this, they would not be taxed. That's already law. So we're taking advantage of some creative financing options that's only available to the co-op. And, therefore taxing those assets under that premise doesn't have a lot of integrity. So for what it's worth, that's how I've been thinking about it. But we got to do careful work, obviously.
I'd like to do it. I think we've been asking the co-ops and Velco, who was stringing cable, to make that available to citizens. But But we do have an issue of taxing their electric, cross subsidizing. So we've got to find a way around that.
I think,
Okay,
you know, that
Senator McDonald.
On that issue, Madam Chair, the taxation, relieving taxation is an issue that can be quantified and benefits to building out. The other aspect is how to take advantage of the CUD's ability to borrow money at substantially lower rates. And if
It's
CUD,
the utilities that can borrow, the co-ops that can borrow at substantially lower rates.
and CUDs are a form of co-op, and so there might be a way here to reduce the amount of money, or to be able to borrow money much more cheaply than having the investor-owned utilities to do it. And
Okay.
and for simply getting that fiber out there to service the countryside, that's one question we have to answer: how to get it out there most cheaply. Then the next one is, who gets access to it, and how do we mediate the equal access, and et cetera, et cetera. That's a separate, but also something we're going to have to try and resolve. Two things going on at the same time for different purposes. Thank you.
Well, that question is still out there, and that is, when we put public money in, what options do we have if we have paid for 20 miles of line extension and then the owner sells it? Does the state have any power? Do we have the power to require open access? I believe the bill we passed has still been put on hold because of federal lawsuits they were waiting to see. But that is an open question also, is can we mandate universal access?
Madam Chair, on that question, it's similar to the decisions that the legislature made when Green Mountain Power was about to go bankrupt, and we bankrolled them to prevent them from going bankrupt. And in the process, we passed in statute that should they turn around and sell at windfall profits, that the state be made whole, reimbursed, or whatever for the windfall gain. And we might argue that the state didn't get back as much money as it should have, or that it was a clumsy process. But we have a precedent for that. And I think the question you just asked, what happens if one of the things that's been the new broadband build outs by private investors,
unnamed Station X,
gets built out, and now that it's built out, the next day it gets sold to someone else to operate it, and the state just invested millions of dollars in its build out.
Right, that's the question.
Thank you for asking it, Madam Chair.
That
Thank you
is
for
on the
asking it.
list.
Needs to be answered.
Okay. Okay, any other questions, comments, anything you'd like added to the agenda next week? I'm going to try and see if I can't get some of these questions put in there for next week and see where that goes, okay? Is Faith still? Oh yeah, it's not 4 o'clock. Faith, you're still here?
I'm still here.
Maybe we could ask Abby when she's in next week, or Maria, when they're talking about S64, maybe after that we could ask for a briefing on what kind of legislative power or ability to recoup state funds that are invested in a for-profit or a not-for-profit when it's sold. It's possible that a PUC could decide to sell out.
I've
to-
asked them that. You had mentioned it earlier, so
Yeah.
they're aware of it and will be part of the discussion at S64.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay. So anything else? Senator Bray?
Yeah, just along the, while we're wrapping up that discussion, you know, the had it drafted the way it was drafted, but I contemplated the idea that there could be conditions, you know, you might say, well, anyone can sign up for this as long as they meet these three criteria, you know, like the open access, recovery upon sale, et cetera, and then it wouldn't necessarily have to be limited to a co-op, but it was the co-op's unique ability to access that super low cost money that was part of the attraction, and the fact that it's owned by the people who are served by it. So it feels like a particularly stable kind of investment.
Well, this wouldn't, yeah. That's the difference. They aren't necessarily serving just they would be leasing out these lines or the cables. So
Right.
that's a different investment. I think we need to understand and see how that goes.
Sure.
Okay.
Right. And thinking aloud about it, you could even say, well, would a co-op ever sell off that asset in 10 years? They
That's,
say, oh,
yeah,
we want to get
I
out
think
of,
that's,
we wanna get out of that business.
yeah, I don't think we should ever assume that because we like co-ops, they might never do anything we wouldn't want them to do. I think there's been some sales in dairy co-ops. This needs to be everybody. What happens when we put state public dollars into any entity? What happens when that entity is sold for profit? Of course, it could be sold for a loss, and I don't know that we want to be involved in that. But yeah, what do we write into the contract when we give them the money?
But the bill isn't about giving them money. It's about whether or not to tax them or not. And so
Right.
if it comes out of co-op or municipal hands, just like if the town sold a school building, it goes onto the tax rolls. I don't see why it's not.
Well, whenever we've put, if we're smart, significant public dollar, the locals decide what they're going to do. We put significant dollars in the School for the Deaf in Brattleboro, whose name is escaping me. And the contract was that we were improving their school. And if and when that's because we knew the school was on somewhat shaky grounds, if and when that school closed and the property was sold, the state would recoup its investment. And we've done that more than once when we have put state dollars into what is essentially a private enterprise that if and when it's sold, otherwise we're just giving money.
But we're not giving money. It's tax.
Right.
It's a removal from the tax roll. So
Tax rolls, yes,
so
but we're foregoing revenue.
sure.
Okay.
And so when it's sold to a private entity that is applied, the tax then just
Goes on
applies.
there, right.
This doesn't seem like a big mystery.
Well, on this one,
straightforward.
but on other ones where we have paid to string the lines and we have put money into stringing the lines. So we've paid for the lines with this last infusion of tax dollars. If those lines get sold, do we get to recoup the public money to put it back into stringing more lines for more people? I think that, I mean, that to me is just what is our legal ability? And should we do that? Can we is one question, should we is another? But I think we need to know, can we? Because the issue is coming up. There are rumors. So I think we should know what the groundwork is. Okay, anything else? All right, have a good weekend. We will see everybody on Tuesday. All right,